I'm Trahern Cruz, uh, one of the great seven co-chairs of the Green Party of the United States. I'm also with the Black Caucus Green Party of the United States Reparations Working Group, and I am the chair of the Minnesota Green Party and a lead organizer here in Minnesota with Black Lives Matter Minnesota. As you guys well know, George Floyd was killed here in Minnesota by the Minneapolis police. So we're going to have a discussion about that today. And we have Robin Harris, the co-chair of Florida, is also on the line with our communications manager out of New York, Michael O'Neill, and they will introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Robin Harris, Florida, state of Florida co-chair and co-chair of National Black Caucus along with Daryl Mock. Also community activist here in Central Florida, just kind of plugged into various groups here. More recently, we just formed Florida Now Racial Justice Task Force, and I'm going to serve as the legislative director. So just plugging in different areas. Hopefully, this can take us beyond what we need to be doing on the ground and above. So I want to thank Trey and Michael and for all the support we've been getting around the nation here.
Okay, so about on Memorial Day, May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. Officer Chauvin, who has had prior incidents of violence throughout his career, had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 terrorizing, agonizing minutes until he ultimately died. This was live streamed by a Minneapolis resident, so and it caused a lot of outrage here in Minnesota and throughout the country. So we came together to here in Minnesota. We started protesting and demanding justice, and then it took off across the nation. As we were protesting, we were starting to make demands that the officers should be arrested, because if I or anyone else on this line murdered somebody, especially on TV, they would have been arrested right away. But in this case, it took at least a week for the officer to be arrested. And that was still record time when it comes to officers being arrested after they kill a Black life. And so those were some of the things. So Chauvin was the first officer who was arrested after he murdered George Floyd. But when he did murder George Floyd, there were 3 other officers there. So there was Officer Tutau stood watch and was making sure that nobody interfered, or that no residents interfered while Officer Chauvin was murdering or choking his knee on the neck of George Floyd for those 8 to 10 minutes. There were 2 other officers who were holding George's legs and stuff. So eventually, first, the community demanded for the officers to be fired. The officers were fired right away. Then the community kept protesting, and then the next demands were to arrest the officers. And then Officer Chauvin was arrested first, and the community was still angry and wanted all 4 officers arrested. And I'm happy to report that yesterday, or Wednesday, I believe it was, all 4 officers involved in the murder of George Floyd have been arrested and charged. It took a lot of work and a lot of pressure from the community. There were massive protests throughout the state and throughout the country, and then what I will call civil disobedience started, where people were out in the street all day and all night, and then even to the point where some of the buildings were being burned down and windows being broken and things like that. I'd like to hand it off to Robin so she can tell us how it affected the people in Florida also.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, great summary. Yeah, so watching that, um, when I saw the video at first, I just couldn't believe because I'm watching the bystanders, say, hey, take your neck off of him. His nose is bleeding, and they're screaming. And there's one guy, I guess he may have known some of the officers, he's like, I know that move that you're doing. What are you doing? You don't need to do that to him. Check him, let him breathe. And so, of course, that just as an individual here in Florida, that just it was sickening. And 42 seconds in, he calls for his mom, and that's a whole nother conversation. But so yeah, so before there was a story about him being arrested, what happened was Derek Chauvin decided to come to Florida. And, he's on a police salary, police officer salary, but some kind of way he's able to, or has been able to, have a second home in Windermere, Florida. Windermere, Florida is a very luxurious place. It's, I go there to take a drive because it's very nice, very peaceable looking. And so someone released on Facebook the address of where he lived. That's how we found out. And so whether this was an accident or whatever, the next thing I noticed that one of the community organizers or activists here in Florida was like, hey, anybody want to meet me here at 3? We'll be here. So people before that time actually had been there. They vandalized his home. And I think the initial message that Florida wanted to send on this was not just for Floyd, but Florida cannot continue to be a safe haven for white supremacists. Because this is where George Zimmerman lives, or he's been hiding out here too, probably others, but Derek, you're not going to be here. And so I think they sent a very specific message. His home was gathered. A few things I didn't like about that, and we'll talk about that later. But as I approached, I noticed the heavy police presence there. But Florida has been pretty much plugged into civil disobedience and varied groups pretty much since that day.
So one of the first things that so as we started protesting, I can go through the first day that it happened. We were on the ground, I think, the next day, and we put together a really big protest. And the Green Party of Minnesota played a big part in that. Black Lives Matter Minnesota played a big part in that, and we were in silent. And a couple other organizations helped us organize that too, like the Racial Justice Network, Justice for Marcus Golden, Justice for Hardell, TCC for Twin Cities Coalition, Justice for Jamar, and others. So we had a really big protest right at the place where it happened. And then since that day, people have just been holding that space and have not left. And they've had concerts and food and barbecues and clothing giveaways, diapers giveaways. It's just a place where people can come. Right now, the place where he died is a place where people can just come, connect, and be in community together and get free food and supplies. So that was the first night that we were there. Then other groups started to leave off, and then I don't know if it was that night or the second night, we started to protest in front of the 3rd precinct. And then in front of the 3rd precinct, there was an AutoZone, there's a liquor store, and then there's a Target right there. So then the police were on top of the 3rd precinct shooting rubber bullets at the protesters and stuff. So then the protesters start throwing bottles and throwing stuff back. They would shoot tear gas at us and things like that. So some of the people would start throwing it back. Then there was a point where I know they said somebody at first they were saying there's outside agitators coming into Minnesota and causing a lot of the issues, which I would say maybe 50-50, but the AutoZone, the AutoZone window got broken. And then I think there was a fire might have been set. And then the Target across the street from the AutoZone, windows got broken out of there. And then you started seeing people coming out of there with stuff. And there was a liquor store. Actually, right across the street from the police station is a liquor store. And then that had got broken into. So you're seeing people were coming out with things like that. And then the second day, it started happening in St. Paul. So it was at the Target there, then there was a tire store there, then there was a Leanne Chan's there. And then it just started growing throughout the city. So there would be marches, but then there would also be a certain level of civil disobedience. And I'll let Robin go into some things. I think she has some thoughts about that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, I think everything that you've mentioned has been necessary, timely, and essential. And maybe a place to start is, there has been a lot of reports of, infiltrators. I don't know, but I think, and I started thinking about how that made me feel. And I think what's happening is it's an attempt, and I'm sure this is historical. It's an attempt to kind of take the power away from the people on the streets,
right?
As if we don't know how to strategize, and because some of the places that have been burned are looted, are institutions of oppression. I was happy when I heard that I guess it'd be your precinct was burned to the ground. I applauded that night, and about how strategic, and that sends a powerful message. And hopefully not to get too far ahead from our conversation, but I believe that we owe, and I was talking about this last night with the Southern Black Lives Matter group. We owe the streets. We owe the streets big time, because if it had not been for them, I think we would still be at the third degree, murder in the third degree,
or not even charging. Right. Yeah. Because after the police precinct was burned down to the ground, then the next day, boom, then the charges came.
Mm-hmm.
And that hasn't really happened before like that. But if people weren't out in the streets, they were, and he's still going to work on it. We call him KKK Crow here, but Bob Crow is the head of the Minneapolis Police Federation, which is the police union. And he's going to fight hard to get those officers their job back, which has happened here in St. Paul before. With there was a guy named his name was George too, I think, and he had police let their dog bite him up, and then they stomped on his chest, collapsed his rib. The chief of police fired the officer, but then the union fought, and then he got his job back. But ultimately, he did end up losing his job again. But we just know that the police union is going to step in and fight hard and raise money for these guys' defense and things like that. So we still have a long fight ahead of us. But I don't think that if there wasn't, and I'm not condoning it, well, I do believe, like what you said, that we do have a lot of gratitude to the streets and to the grassroots, per se, in the Black community. There were people coming down saying, hey, don't burn down things in your own community. So then this is where we say, well, when you say something's your own community, that means that you own something in that community. Here in St. Paul or Minneapolis, Black people have no ownership on there may have been like one Black store on Lake Street that is Black owned or owned by the descendants of people whose ancestors went through slavery, sharecropping, and whatever, or even home ownership with Black people. We have the biggest disparities in America here in the Twin Cities. So they say the Twin Cities is the best place to live, one of the best places to live, but for Black people, it's the worst place to live. So a lot of that is because we don't have ownership. We don't have ownership in businesses. We don't have ownership in or home ownership. So when you don't have ownership, you don't feel like. I think if we had more ownership, people wouldn't have been burning things down like that or
Yeah,
going
but
in
I
there
think we have
looting.
to be careful because that's still kind of like it's an undermining. I mean, the colonizer doesn't get to tell oppressed people how to respond. We've been dealing with this for well over 400 years, um, and you have the whole concept of property or people over property, and that's what it was. It's violence is not to hit a building, but to and it was very a profound statement to have a white man to lean in on the neck of a black man while he is in handcuffs. That's violent. That's savagery. That's oppression. That's that's everything that we are fighting. That we are fighting against. The streets, black people, brown people, working class people. They owe no one an apology for what's happening to these buildings. Nashville, the courthouse was burned down. That's another symbol of oppression. So there's no real explanation needed. Then we need to, you haven't listened. You haven't been listening to us. And George was last week. In that same week, I think it was Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud. So we're talking about history, this historical, these historical names that are being made, unfortunately, through violence, and
Right.
so we have to fight back.
And I totally agree with what you say. But from a people who were considered property, who were considered a commodity, police was called on George because of he supposedly had a fake $20 bill. Then it evolved to maybe he had a bad check. So the issue was around economics, period. And when we have these disparities here in Minnesota, where people were even if we're saying, it's not about capitalism or things like that, but if you don't have ownership, it's just like if I'm not feeling like I'm invested in this community socially, politically, or economically, then I'm not going to care for burning down buildings. Because it wasn't just the police department that got burnt down.
Right.
The Target got burnt down, and people went in there and they looted. And what people told me is, thank you, because I didn't get a stimulus check yet. I don't have a job right now. I'm homeless. And this was a white woman. It was like she needed to go in there and loot it because she's hungry, and so when people are hungry or when people are being deprived of the necessities of life, they're going to lash out in a certain way. So it wasn't just it was about the murder of George Floyd, but there were other underlining reasons that it sparked like that. There was other tensions that led to that than just the killing of George Floyd. There's an economic current underneath beneath this backdrop, and has to do with the disparities in the Twin Cities, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in housing, whether it's in employment. We have the biggest education gap in America in the city in Minnesota. So these are some of the underlying issues that led up to Mr. Floyd's death. And even if we look back at other instances, there's going to be issues of economics involved. I think that it's important that we say, so when we're talking about rebuilding now in the Twin Cities, when we talk about rebuilding, we need to make sure that if we're going to rebuild businesses, that a big chunk of that rebuilding money is going to the people who are affected by police brutality the most. and that we're getting the goods and resources that we need to be able to access living in one of the greatest cities in America to live in.
Okay, so yeah, I want to I guess just step in when we talk. Yeah, economics and all that it is a discussion because that's who has the power, and so when people are powerless, they tend to rebel, and I think this is what we're seeing played out, and I think but we have to roll back because our conversation is about George Floyd and beyond. Where do we go from here? Rebuilding, but I think there's a dismantling so that when there is something built, that it won't resemble what was there before. And so reformation, police reforming, I think all those conversations should be taken off the table now because we need overhaul. We need to start talking about policies that and not many of our candidates and politicians really address some. These deaths that we're seeing, these are state sanctioned murders because no one has ever touched or wanted to deal with the law enforcement Bill of Rights. This is why the cops get away with it, because we have policies that protect them, years and years of policy. Oh, I'm afraid. Now there may be an easy out with this one because George was handcuffed and he posed no danger, but there's still the Bill of Rights that still gives Mr. So-called Mr. Chauvin some type of protection. But I don't think I think our conversation should be around now that the street has made such a forceful effort. Where do we talk about where are our logistics for policies? And I think it's a dangerous thing if we allow the white narrative to come in, and it kind of we have the celebrities that are coming in, Al Sharpton, and all that. It dilutes what the real effort is, because it's geared around one person, which he should be memorialized. But we're talking about a system. This is systemic racism. This is years and years and years of, like we talked about, disparity. So we're talking about years of this. So we need an overhaul, and not just reformations or reforms or police reforming. We need an overhaul. We need community-oriented policing where Black people, we're in charge of our own neighborhoods.
Absolutely, and that's what I mean. So right here on the ground in St. Paul, when we were in Target, the police was in front of Target protecting Target. So they're protecting the corporations, but they're not protecting the people. So, and this is what and this has to do with economics. So that's why it's even when we talk about rebuilding or we're talking about dismantling, it's still going to be a conversation about economics and who gets what. And that's why, and that's what the police were started for here in Minnesota, was to protect the property owners. You don't own property, whether it's community owned, whether it's Black people owning a co-op of housing or co-op businesses. We're not there. And if we're not there, we're not getting a piece of that pie. After so much, things are going to build up, and then we're going to the youth, especially, who deserve justice socially, politically, and economically, are going to lash out. So when we're rebuilding, we have to have a conversation about economics and how we're going, because this is about property, and property is about wealth and economics and things like that. And even here, just like right now, if we go over on our way to 38th Street, there's just a store. I don't know what's in it, but the military is protecting the store. They've been there for 2 days. And it's just like a little storefront. But our U.S. military is standing around this building protecting a piece of property instead of protect. So even when we were at the Capitol, they had the sheriffs, they had the the Army Reserve, and then behind them there was the sheriffs, and then there was the Capitol. So they're protecting the Capitol because they didn't want us to go in there and do whatever they thought that people were going to do. And what our thing was to the Army is the people you're protecting are killing your brothers and your sisters and other American citizens, and that you should be protecting us and not them.
There's a lot in that. It sounds like a power poise or stance which is what a lot of this is. And also we have to be careful in, there are a lot of folks that happened here in Orange County too, Florida, where, they took a knee in solidarity. Well, that's no, we don't know. And, we called out one of our state reps on it who since has apologized, but we're not impressed. It's not acceptable. We see right through it, because while they were doing that, they were also giving the order to tear gas protesters. So we know that's bogus. So, but when you bring in the police to lead your protest, to walk with you, that sends a mixed signal, and it's counterproductive. So a lot of that's been happening too, where people have been allowing the police to lead the protest so they can remain peaceful. But why? Our ancestors always just showed up. We don't need permission to fight the enemy when it's the enemy that we're fighting. So I think we have to get in our minds that we're going to lead this revolution or not. And I think it would be a disservice to those who have been on the ground to not come with some strong talking points that lead to strong legislation, which has to be the next step. Strong legislation has to be the next step. If we're not dismantling state-sanctioned violence, state-sanctioned murdering, we're just going to keep repeating the same cycle over and over. And I think it's very profound too, because on the ground, we got Black people, and I saw a clip, I'm not sure whether it was in Minnesota, I'm sure it's all over, but we saw a lot of working class people, white women who have stepped out of their liberal thinking, and they locked arms and they protected the protesters, the Black protesters. And that sends a strong message to the enemy when he sees this culmination of working class people and Black people, rising up against and pushing back. That sends a strong message. It's kind of like, I'm not a Marxist, but like reading in Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, he talks about the lumpen proletariats. He talks about the scum of the earth, the working class, and all that. This is the rising up of what we're seeing right now. Those who have been counted out, oh, you're just this, you're just that, but they're the ones that's leading the way. And I think we would do them a disservice by voting people like Joe Biden in, who says, oh, just shoot them in the leg.
Right. And Joe Biden was actually invited to the funeral or the memorial service here. And I think, it upset a lot of the people who were on the ground, who were doing the work. So like you said, talking about taking a knee, we were at the mansion the other day and the police tried to come in our space and they wanted to take a knee, and we had to tell them that they were not welcome to do that. We also started presenting policies that we're hearing. So we said, our mayor was here in St. Paul was elected on a police brutality mandate. But like you're saying, he wasn't the one doing that work on the ground, but he got elected off the work that others were doing. But now that you're in, we say we want an independent investigation to any police-related shooting that has resulted in death since the year 2000. And because we had you had like close to 4,000 people at the governor's mansion, when we made that demand, the very next day, they announced independent investigate. They did a re-review of the policies of the Minneapolis Police Department for the last 10 years. Then the city council started talking about defunding the Minneapolis Police Department, or even just dissolving it. And then today, We just seen that the Minneapolis Police Department just banned chokeholds. And so these are the things, if we continue to put pressure on them and follow them up with demands and stay in the streets, that we will see systematic change. Sometimes it happens overnight, like the arrest happened overnight. The re-review of policies and procedures of the Minneapolis Police Department happened overnight. So we have to continue to stay on the streets, but also educate ourselves on what we need to happen to prevent the police from terrorizing us in our neighborhoods and things like that. So those were some very powerful things that happened because of the protests. We wish George Floyd didn't have to die for us to get these changes to the laws, but we want to continue to keep this pressure on them so that this doesn't continue to happen in the future.
Yeah, you're right. I think it was today or yesterday here in Florida, one of our senators who's up for re-election, Senator Randolph Bracy, he made a press conference and he was talking about he wanted to create some legislation, and he made some demands. And I was cringing at all of them because those have already been, been introduced before, and we're still here.
Right.
So we need folks to really dig in. They know what the legislation is. They know there's so many layers to this in the state, and there's so many, follow the money, as we always say in politics. And it's so many corporations that are invested in prisons, private prisons, all this, the tear gas they use here. Remember back in Ferguson, it's the same tear gas they use that the Army uses. So we have to demand a withdrawal of this military occupation that's in our neighborhoods. But Senator, my plea to Senator Bracy was that, Senator, I appreciate you making an effort, but citizens review boards do not work. They have no teeth because you guys do what you want to do anyway. So we need politicians that are going to make strong legislative policies that aren't afraid to take big money out of their pocket. And I think there's a question from the chat. Y'all know
that. So I seen that, and before I answer that, I just want to follow up. Even to come and want to take a knee after Mr. Chauvin had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes was just like, so Amy Klobuchar, like, why would you want to take a knee? We need you to stand up for justice is what we need you to do. We need you to stand up when you see, so they also made a law saying if an officer sees somebody doing something, killing somebody, that they're required to step in and make them stop. And even when we're recording stuff as citizens, it's cool to record, but sometimes if you can save a life, because just if he could have got a couple seconds to breathe, or just somebody could have pushed him for a second, and I know it's dangerous to do that, but let's just stop watching each other die like that. But Amy Klobuchar came to the memorial service yesterday and she took a knee. And people were like, that's like the KKK coming to your funeral and taking a knee, because Amy Klobuchar implemented, and Joe Biden too. Joe Biden wrote the biggest crime bill, 1994 crime bill, which was the biggest crime bill in American history. Joe Biden's name has been on every crime bill since 1976. I'm 45 years old. I was born in 74. So my whole life, Joe Biden has been being tough on crime, and that's a code word for being tough on Black people, right?
Absolutely.
So for us to invite somebody like that, Amy Klobuchar implemented those policies. So Amy Klobuchar pushed the 1033 grant program that allows the Pentagon to sell those weapons to the police department and tanks that are being used on protesters right now. So that was a big smack in the face. So when we're talking about strong policies, ending the 1033 grant program, requiring police to carry insurance like doctors carry insurance. They don't want bad drivers on the road. We don't want bad cops on the police force. We want community control of the police. where the community is deciding what officers should be hired and what officers should be fired in our community, or some people call it Black community control of the police. Then we want a registry of cops who are bad cops, or so that they can't get fired in Minnesota, then go down to Florida or go down to New Mexico and become a cop and start terrorizing people down there too. So those are just a couple policy things that I know. I know that I think that the Green Party is either thinking about or has already passed.
Yeah, I know in Florida we just had our state AMM, and we just created the lead of our other co-chair, a legislative committee, and I'm going to suggest that some of these policies that we start working on. I know that there is an organization in Jacksonville, Florida, who's been trying to work around repealing LEBOR, repealing Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. And I think if we stand in solidarity and we can get some attention around that and find the strongest candidate, that's one thing that we can do. Also, like you say, the 1033 program needs to cease. That's a really good one. And, body cameras, I'm really annoyed with that whole conversation, because they can be turned off, they can be turned on. It's nothing more than a computer.
Yep.
So that's not working anymore. But I think we need some real strong legislation, and the Green Party should be leading that. And we should be finding ways to, this goes back to building candidates, more candidates, bring them in, Black candidates, strong candidates, working class people that can carry that message, and that's not moved by big money. So I think that's one way we can start creating policies around this.
Absolutely. Also, some of the things that just happened here, we think should happen. What happened in Minneapolis, and we would like to see it happen here in St. Paul, is getting SROs out of school. So after this happened with the Minneapolis Police Department, the school board in Minneapolis voted to get rid of police in schools. Mm-hmm. And we think that same thing should happen here in St. Paul too. So we encourage people, while this is happening and we have the attention of lawmakers, that we start putting together really. And then one thing, the Green Party of the United States is the only political entity in America that has as its platform reparations for those of us who were enslaved. And I know part of the 10-point program is addressing, the NARC 10-point program addresses the criminal injustice system and making sure that there's a good way. So George Floyd had, we want when people, I may have family members that are re-entering into society. We want to make sure that there's a group of Black people that when people are getting out of prison, that we can help them get jobs, we can help them get housing, that we're there to help them get on the right track to reduce recidivism and stuff. We also want to release all political prisoners, but that's kind of old. So some of my friends have been arrested for protesting and things like that. We feel like all those charges should be dropped. Also, COVID-19, there's people in jail right now or in prisons for nonviolent offenses who should be released so that they don't die of COVID-19. So the reparations is another policy that the Green Party does have, but it's just not about cash payment. There's other components to that. And one of those components is addressing mass incarceration and police brutality and police terror and against Black people in the United States.
Yeah, I like that. Because also what we should be doing, a whole reparations piece can be turned into a policy where in HR 40 addressed, and I think it's been nuanced, is where it says that we need to search and destroy all Black codes. because the police system itself, is the latter day or former day slave patrol.
That's right.
And we have all curfews. All these are just black codes because it's really being targeted against certain communities. Some of your upper Windermere don't have no curfew. That's where Chauvin was going to hide out at. So, but these curfews are really being implemented in the oppressed neighborhoods.
That's right.
And so, but these are codes. These are old Jim Crow codes. These are old black codes that are resurfacing with different names. So part of that whole reparations piece is we have to have folks willing to research and destroy and again dismantle these codes that are affecting us.
So just to follow up on that, there's a movie called Jim Crow of the North that actually says that Jim Crow started here in Minnesota and was exported to the South. So they had these housing things. It was called, and this is still about George Floyd, but it was called racial covenants, and that black people wouldn't be able to buy certain houses in certain areas. And then if you can't buy a house in that area, even if you're qualified, that makes you lose out on generational wealth and then push you in a certain neighborhood. And that's what happened here over, like they had a map. So even right now, we have things that are called the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, which cities use to plan for their next 20 years. And it says this person is going to live here. He's going to work. They're already planning for us. So I think it's important for the black community to start having our own 2040 comprehensive plans. So we say, this is where we're going to work in 20 years. This is where black people are going to work in the next 20 to 30 years. These are the schools they're going to live in. These are the houses they're going to live in. And then you have to create the resources or the situations and the circumstances to make that happen. Right now, something just going back to policy, that's being held up in the Senate right now. It might have passed the House was anti-lynching laws. Going back to the black codes that you were talking about, that's something that we should really be. Lynching shouldn't happen anymore in the United States, and I think that Republicans and Democrats should be able to agree that we should not be lynching people in 2020. So that's another law that I think that people should be putting pressure on.
Yeah, that brings up a lot about the regions. I'm in the South, and we've been impacted. The whole Trump campaign was complete Southern strategy. These key words that were used, law and order, all these things, and it impacts the South has its own flavor of racial discrimination and violence that and sometimes in my thought maybe the North doesn't have, but we're seeing more that it is still intersectional. And I think this is why the Democrats would do very well to understand that they're just the party of George Wallace. And he was a big time racist. And so we see that blended political ideology of Biden and Trump. And it's I don't think he's using any type of strategy, because he said he was going to pretty much just stay at home and just let Trump say everything. And so there's a real need for the Green Party to stand up. We know we won't win the White House, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other seats, other legislations that we cannot win. And I think that's very imperative that, like you say, we research, we apply pressure on senators and senators and representatives to be able and be willing to dismantle. Because if not, we're going to keep seeing the burnings. This is, I think I talked about it earlier. This is the call of the proletariats. They're rising up because we've been robbed of our power.
Right.
I think when I ran for office, I realized how these 50-year plans or 10-year plans, they're way ahead of us, and that has been done on purpose. So we have to fight. We have to take it back. And this is why it's important to have strong white allies who aren't afraid to stand with us, who aren't afraid to support with money. We don't need y'all to wait till HR 40 is passed, because that's, it's such a political ploy. We don't need y'all to wait till you can start participating in reparations now. That's why we're saying reparations now. Support, help us, but allow us to have our own narrative and take our lead. I'm very thankful to the calls that I got this weekend, because normally I would be on the ground. I got calls from people. Do you need bail money? Do you need money for jail? What do you, any of your friends in jail? I have resources for attorneys. So I appreciate that. So those type things are what we need to help dismantle this, to help and to also to make reparations be present right now.
Yep. And like you're saying, we got so many calls from white allies, just allies, period. And I don't want to, the fact that people were doing protests in Florida, in California, I mean, in every 50 states, I seen a map, and it had every state that there was a protest for George Floyd, and the whole map was lit out. And then they had them in Italy, they had them in Australia, they had them in London. So this became a global movement within like a week. And that lets you know that the world is tired of white supremacy and institutional racism, and that we're standing up, and the Green Party is in a position to even before George Floyd, I started realizing, like, wow, the Green Party's in a position to do certain things. So when COVID hit, it didn't feel like we had missed a beat, and other ones did.
Oh, it says, any comments on what we've seen in New York City? Response from Progressive Mayor Bill de Blasio and Governor Cuomo. The only comment that I'm going to make, because Trey may have more information, I have a Green Party comrade that's in New York, and to quote him, he is very prolific, but I'm just going to quote him. He says that, sarcastic. He says Cuomo is garbage, because he's implemented a lot of behind the scenes, behind his whole stance, on this whole COVID. He was front and center every day, but meanwhile he was implementing and perpetuating police presence, hyping it up, causing a lot of issues in the community. So it's not all what we saw. So I'm not sure about, is Bill de Blasio the one that has the black son or something?
Mm-hmm. That was arrested at the protest. And
okay. That was it was his daughter, right?
Daughter, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's great, and we're glad that the children are out protesting. We wish Mr. de Blasio was out getting arrested and standing up for justice, considering what happened to Eric Gardner and others in the state of New York. I personally don't think that, I think Cuomo I think he's like one of the worst governors in America right now, because he has so many.
My governor.
He has so much death on his hands. If the numbers that are coming out of New York are right about COVID-19, in October 18th, if you Google New York practices for pandemic, you're going to see October 18th that they did a practice in New York, and they had a model where 65 million people were died. It's going to freak you out if you watch it. Me and my son been watching it for the last couple of months, and it's just like, these people, if you knew this was going to happen, you could have prepared people back in October, November. That just when you get a chance, anybody watching this, Google pandemic New York estimates 65 million deaths, and then you'll see what I'm talking about, and it's gonna be just what you see on TV every day. But and one of my steering committee members came up with a term that I like to use a lot. Gloria Materia was the first person that I heard say problematic in a certain way. So I've been using that word, saying that phrase problematic, since I heard her say it. And you just introduced a new one, intersectional racism. And I would like to be able to say that, if that's okay with you, because I think that's
absolutely. Yeah, Kimberly, I'm not that smart. I got that from Kimberly Crenshaw. She kind of, I guess, would be one of the mothers of the whole intersectional idea. But that's this movement that we're in, this on the ground. It has to be intersectional. It has to be intergenerational. I think it's beautiful that the young people are out there. I'm getting on up there, so I'm in the generation. You know, I don't tell my age, but I'm in Generation X, of course, and I'm this close to wanting to be back out there because I think that we need to stand with the young people any way that we can. And I think age and wisdom should gel very well. They have the passion, they can run. Because if I threw a rock, I would definitely be caught. So, but you know, but I don't oppose that. But I think that if we could just find a way to gel together, it can even be a more dynamic movement.
Yeah, and we need our elders to try not to, like what you're doing. We need more of that from our elders, not to extinguish the fire that the youth have. Because when Jamar Clark happened, the youth came to the police station. That's the fifth precinct. The one that was burnt down was the third precinct. The fifth precinct is over north, and that's like a block where Jamar Clark was killed. And they came with that same energy, but there were community leaders that told them, "Oh no, just relax, and everything's gonna be okay."
Right.
Then Jamar Clark's killers didn't get arrested. Justine, the mom, received $20 million. There was no video of it, no tapes of it. And Jamar Clark received $200,000, and there were no arrests or anything like that. So we commend the youth. If there's anything, and again, commend everyone who's protesting around the world. I'll let Robin get some closing remarks, and then I'll say one last closing remark.
Yeah, I think I just kind of want to go back to this. It's been I haven't had any physical children, but again, like I said, 42 seconds into the video, you hear George cry for his mom, and that has stuck with me. But it also gives me chills because I found out that she had made her transition almost a year ago. And so I remember I posted that his mama is coming, and I mean that in the sense of, you know, be allowing the spirit of what his mom probably would do live in us, and we come and we push back against white supremacy, because I believe that this is a legitimate rebellion.
And I think you summed it up perfectly, so we can end on that. Thank everybody for listening, and please continue to protest in your city, in your state, and in your country, wherever you're at. Thank you. And donate to the Green Party Black Caucus, and the Green Party of the United States, and the Green Party of Florida, and the Green Party of Minnesota, and the Green Party of New York.
Yes, Syracuse. Thank you, Michael. Good night.
Thanks, Mike.